Thanks, Isadora. And I think Catherine has my slides maybe to share. That'd be great. So I'm really glad to be here and talk with you, and it's nice to see some friends on the call. And I wish we were all in a room together so we could actually have a really good conversation about this, because a bit like Marcel said, I don't necessarily think United Ways or United Way Greater Toronto is doing this better, but we've certainly learned a great deal through the pandemic. And I'm happy to share some of what we've learned with all of you. I want to cover a number of issues, actually, talking a bit about how we've been using data and research to inform our investments, also pre-pandemic, how we evolved our funding approach through the pandemic. And, we've done that before the pandemic, but what did we learn during the pandemic so that we're seeing some emerging opportunities, I think, to think about how we use our old approaches in combination with new approaches, and maybe even thinking about how we use them differentially depending on how we want to support the recovery and try to create a stronger community service ecosystem going forward. And I saw there was a question in the chat, are we rethinking, is this a chance to reimagine our granting? And I think it very much is. So next slide, I'll start just with a little bit about United Way. I think many of you might be familiar with United Ways across the country, and you can go to the next slide. We're a large funder, but we also cover a vast territory. So many of you probably know that we run an annual fundraising campaign in United Way Greater Toronto. We provide then grants to organizations across Peel, Toronto, and York, with over $80 million going out into community work annually. So we are the largest non-government funding funder in the GTA. But again, we're still small relative to government, and we're still a part of that funding ecosystem with so many of you that are on this call. I think the other function that we have in addition to granting is bringing people together, whether it be academic partners related to our research or donors and volunteers. And as Gillian described, we always have volunteers involved in our funding processes. We've become very, very focused and clear about our intentions to address poverty and to try to alleviate poverty, find pathways out of poverty, and address some of the underlying causes of poverty in the GTA. The way in which we work with our network of services and government partners, I think, has become more and more relevant through the pandemic. So maybe I'll just go to the next slide. I think one of the things we found through the pandemic for sure is that our approach pre-pandemic is a great foundation for what we've seen, the patterns and the issues that we're seeing in the pandemic. So some of the work that Marcel spoke about, the network of services that we fund became very critical to mobilize in terms of community response and to intersect with the health system and other bigger systems to actually address the needs during the pandemic. We've also seen, though, that this network of services does need some help and support in coordinating, and some help and support. It's identifying the issues on the ground, but it needs a little support in linking with the bigger system players, local governments, even provincial, even federal governments, as well as some of the other big systems players, for example, in healthcare. And that became an important role for United Way during this pandemic. And the way in which we were able to leverage our government relations and public policy work, I think, was pretty important. The other thing that we absolutely found in the GTA especially, but I think this is true actually in other jurisdictions as well, is that the intersections of poverty, equity and reconciliation, and geographic poverty were critical and started to really come to the surface during the pandemic. So If you go to the next slide, one of the things that United Way is known for is its relational funding and its longer term funding. This is a funny slide we did from some network research that we did a couple of years ago as we were trying to make the case for relational funding for general operating support for a strong foundational network of agencies that is linked and connected in order to address poverty. So this was just a visual out of that network research that we did with many of our what we call anchor agencies, so that we could see they were very well networked. And this visual presented that. So going to the next slide. Sorry, I'm skipping around a little, but just coming back to talk about, we've been talking about neighborhood inequalities at United Way Greater Toronto since 2005 with what I would say was a seminal report called Poverty by Postal Code, where we started to say that poverty was concentrating in particular neighborhoods, and where you lived was starting to have a real effect on your opportunities for the future. So, you know, we've always partnered, United Way's always partnered with academic organizations, for example, David Hilchansky at University of Toronto, or we did some research on precarious employment, which has been super relevant during the pandemic with Wayne Luchek at McMaster. So those kinds of historic reports starting in 2005, going right up before the pandemic, actually were already pointing to those growing inequalities, which became so super clear during the pandemic. So if you can go to the next slide. In particular, these three reports that our research team generated just pre-pandemic, one of them, you know, bringing the neighborhoods inequality to work, well, two of them really focusing on neighborhood inequality. The third one starting to talk about equity and reconciliation issues and the way in which certain populations, particularly racialized people, women, and youth, were being left behind in the prosperity in the GTA. So if you go to the next one, just the last slide, a visual on that, where you can see in these reports, this was from our opportunity equation research, where in 1980, the blue neighborhoods represent high income neighborhoods, the yellow middle income, and the red low income. And you can see what happened from 1980 even to 2010, and that trend has continued where we have more high income neighborhoods, more low income neighborhoods, and fewer middle income neighborhoods in the GTA. We also saw that this is true in other larger regions, Calgary, Vancouver, and Montreal for sure. And we're starting to see some of that, for example, in Peel region through the pandemic. So what do we do in the pandemic? Let me take you to the pandemic story for us. The first thing that we did right away was offer flexibility to all of our funded agencies. We said, whatever we were funding you for pre-pandemic, never mind, you tell us what is most important, what needs to be done right now. You know, you could take your early years funding if you're not able to deliver and move it to food systems. You could tell us that it's other infrastructure that you need right now. You just talk to us and we'll be super flexible with the funding, the longer term, the 3 or 5 year grants that we're giving you to be able to deliver on the ground. We historically were known as a long range funder, but I think what we also learned was what was good about that. How do we leverage those relationships? But also, what else could we do to be to bring what Jillian talked about, speed and responsiveness to our approach? And how do we work a bit more with some of the grassroots organizations that were also effective in being able to get to people and populations during the pandemic? So back in March, one of I think probably the best things for us was these clusters or community groups. Tables that we formed. Back in March, some sector leaders called us and said, oh my God, the libraries are closing. Everything is closing. Where are people going to go? Where are they going to go for their food? Where are they going to go for their internet access? What's going to actually happen to the people that we're serving? People were so confused. Are we open? Are we closed? What are the safety procedures? What's happening from the emergency response table at the city and the region of Peel, region of York? So we formed these cluster tables, and they were co-convened by United Way and the City of Toronto. And that was where we pulled our real-time data. What's happening today? What's happening tomorrow? We were meeting 3 times a week with the clusters. What are you learning? What are you seeing? Who's being left out? How do you need to work together? Someone needs a van. Somebody else has food. How is everybody going to coordinate? What's the healthcare system doing? The community health centers were at the table. And we've continued with those clusters throughout the pandemic, and we're still using them as resources and data and way to operationalize on the ground as we move through the pandemic. You know, simultaneously, we ended up putting out a lot of small and emergency grants through our local Love Fund last summer, many of them going to grassroots groups. So we were actually managed to do speed, which we've not really done very well in the past as United Way. We tend to be in for the long game, lots of volunteers, lots of process, it takes us time to get our grants out the door, but we were able to turn those around really fast. And then I see that Dan Clement's on the call with United Way Canada. We were able to distribute over $20 million in the GTA of emergency federal funding, emergency community support funding to the GTA agencies. Within a couple of months, we were able to turn those grants around and get them out on the ground. So we kind of surprised ourselves with our ability to do speed. So I'm going to skip over this slide in the interest of time, but just to say, given our research, if you keep going through with those slides, oh, you got to catch up with me. Couple more, one more. There we go. Sorry, I haven't been helping trigger the slide. We do believe the geographic distribution where programs are located is pretty important. Local responses are critical, connecting grassroots groups to those responses. We have to get to equity-seeking groups. They're the people most affected by the pandemic and most affected by poverty. There's clearly an intersection there, and we need to look at system solutions. So my last couple of comments before my time runs out is that we, if you could go to the, back up to the slide with the blue there. I think what we learned is maybe we need different kind of granting approaches to address different problems in the ecosystem. And maybe we need an ecosystem of community services. So we need some rapid response. We need connections with grassroots groups, maybe smaller grants, lower barrier, less data required, less thorough investigation into the governance, the financial management, the details of the organization to get money out on the ground. For example, in the local Love Fund, I think it was something like 66% of the agencies we funded there were trusteed. So a lot of grassroots groups there. Then the emergency community support funding I talked about, that the federal funding we distributed, a little bigger grants, $50,000 to $100,000. So we wanted a little more information about the agency's ability to deliver, as well as what they hope to accomplish. About 12% of those were trusteed organizations. And then the network of agencies where we want, 3, 5 longer term grants. We want to build the infrastructure. We want to give them general operating support or unrestricted dollars, more flexibility with their dollars. We need to know they have an infrastructure to deliver. And in this case, our last round pre-pandemic, about 7% of our network of agencies are trusteed, which indicates they may not meet all our requirements, but might be delivering on some great programs. And so we learned a lot about how to work with trustees and trusteed organizations. And I think some of what was coming up around how do we work with some key places like, I think you were referring to, is it Pivot in London, but other ONN, some of our other partners, and some great agencies that are doing good capacity building and support work with smaller organizations. And how do we foster partnerships between those smaller organizations and maybe the foundational organizations or ecosystem that provides stability for the sector? So I think that's maybe where I'll stop. Maybe my last slide are some sort of questions for all of us. How do we ensure that we've got larger organizations that can provide the stability, decent work, system solutions. How are we supporting them? How do we diversify that leadership so it is really in touch with what's happening on the ground? And I think a lot of our organizations were during the pandemic, but some maybe not better than others. How do we strengthen some equity-led, focused and serving partners to join that foundational group with longer term, deeper grants? And then grassroots, when should we fund them? I've talked to Jihad Laidlaw about this, and to some of you on this call. When can they reach communities that aren't well served? When do they fill in gaps? When should they not turn into organizations, because they're better to be nimble and less bound by charitable requirements and infrastructure? So we're watching with interest the bill tabled by Senator Omadvar, Bill S222, I think. United Way Canada has come out in favor of some of the flexibility recommended in some of her changes exactly on this work, and I see some stuff going up in the chat there. But I think as funders, we've got a bit of push and pull. Like, are we going to give bigger, longer grants in the foundational structure, or more grants to more agencies, spread our funding thinner to more and smaller organizations? It's always a bit of a tension. I think we probably need to do both, and to be working together as a philanthropic sector to figure out how to do that. So I'll close there and hope there might be some opportunity for conversation.